The metal bat made a hollow clang before the sound was swallowed by a scream that could break glass. 8-year-old Amara crumpled to the ground, her small hands clutching her head, as blood trickled between her fingers. For a moment the world went still. The boy who hit her, 14-year-old Trevor, stood frozen, the bat still in his hands. He wasn't breathing heavy, he wasn't panicked, he was smirking, and his mother, Karen, didn't rush to help the little girl lying on the pavement. She stepped forward, not toward Amara, but toward her son, putting a protective arm across his chest like he was the victim. "Don't touch him," she barked at the crowd forming around them. She provoked him. That's the moment that told me everything. It wasn't just about a bat. It was about power, entitlement, and the dangerous belief that certain people's pain doesn't count. Someone yelled for an ambulance. Someone else called the police. Karen Sitt's voice cut through the chaos. "She sits fine. This doesn't need to go anywhere. You all know her type, always looking for trouble." What she didn't know was who Amara Sitt's father was. And that one fact was about to turn this entire story inside out. Because when injustice hides in plain sight, the right person finding out is like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Violence often starts with the confidence that no one will hold you accountable, but a single action, one swing of a bat, can pull the wrong person into your story. And when that person understands both the law and the streets, the outcome changes completely. And that's where this begins. A little girl fighting for her life. A mother protecting her son's ego instead of someone else's child's skull. And a father, who has no idea yet that the phone call he's about to get will demand every ounce of restraint, strategy, and strength he's ever learned. Amara was the kind of child who could make strangers smile without trying. 8 years old, quick to laugh, with a knack for asking the kind of questions most adults had stopped wondering about. Her father, Marcus Cole, called her Sunbeam. He said she had a light that pushed back the dark. Marcus wasn't the type of man people ignored. 6'3", broad shoulders, an ex-Marine turned community strategist, the kind of person who could walk into a room and calm it, or make it shake. He believed in planning more than reacting, and above all he believed in keeping his daughter out of harm's way. But here sits the thing about harm. It doesn't always come charging through the front door. Sometimes it's allowed to grow quietly in the backyards of privilege, where rules bend for some and snap for others. The Cole family lived in Brookside, a neighborhood people like to call diverse in brochures, but divided in truth. The South Side held mostly black and immigrant families. The North Side, older white families, most with enough money to bend the world around them. The schools were integrated on paper, but playground politics told a different story. Trevor's family lived in that North Side bubble. His mother Karen wasn't just known, she was loudly known. PTA president 3 years running, always at the front of school board meetings, always framing herself as the protector of our kids. But our kids never seemed to include children like Amara. And here sits the root of it. Karen had spent years teaching Trevor, not in words, but in example, that rules were for other people, that if something went wrong she could make it vanish with a phone call or a favor, that he could push and push until someone broke, then walk away clean. The incident with the bat wasn't sudden. It was the product of smaller moments. Trevor cornering Amara and 2 friends the week before, calling them charity cases because of the school's free lunch program. The basketball game where he shoved Amara to the ground, and called it just a joke. Teachers pulling him aside, not to discipline him, but to quietly warn the black kids to stay away from trouble. Systemic injustice rarely arrives dressed as a monster. It comes disguised as little exceptions, little biases, little silences, until one day, a boy with a bat swings, certain the world will catch him, not his victim. And on that day, Trevor swung hard enough to knock an 8-year-old to the ground. She didn't know it yet, but that single act didn't just crack her skull. It cracked open a network of connections, power and protection that her father had been quietly building for decades. But before we get to that, we have to stand in the moment where Marcus hears the news. Because what happens next isn't just about a father's rage. It's about a man deciding whether to burn everything down or use the fire to light the way forward. Karen had spent years building a reputation as the queen bee of Brookside's respectable circles. But Marcus had spent just as long building something far more dangerous: credibility across worlds. Most people only knew one side of him. In City Hall, he was the policy advisor who could talk numbers and legislation without losing the human story. On the South Side he was Cole, the man who'd walk into a corner store argument and walk out with everyone shaking hands. In the Marines, they'd called him Chessman, because he didn't just think 2 moves ahead, he saw the whole board. That's what Karen didn't know. And what Trevor didn't care to imagine. While Amara slept in her hospital bed, Marcus began to make calls. Not the kind you log, but the kind that move in whispers. First call. To an old Marine buddy, now a detective in the neighboring county. He asked for everything on Trevor Matthews and his family. Quiet channels only. Second call. To a civil rights attorney who'd once owed him a favor for securing critical witness testimony in a police misconduct case. Third call. To a local journalist who'd been itching to uncover bias in the school discipline system, a journalist Karen had unknowingly snubbed at a fundraiser last year. By midnight, Marcus already had pieces of the puzzle. Trevor's previous incidents, none of which ever made it into official records. The complaints from other parents that vanished after a phone call from Karen. The security footage from the school playground showing Trevor shoving Amara just a week earlier. Here sits the thing. Karen thought in terms of image. Marcus thought in terms of leverage. She didn't set know it yet, Marcus would later tell a friend, but I wasn't set just after an apology. I was after the system that taught her she never need to give one. The first small reversal came when he learned about the school board's private chat group, a place where certain parents, Karen included, openly discussed which kids were trouble and should be kept in line. Screenshots were sent to his phone anonymously at 2:14 a.m. He didn't set no yet, who sent them. But it didn't matter. Because now, he had the beginnings of a weapon Karen couldn't fight with charm or threats. And as he stared at the images on his phone, Marcus knew. Before this was over, she'd wish it had stayed just between the kids. The first wave of resistance came faster than Marcus expected. By the next morning, before he could even return to the hospital with breakfast for Amara, his phone buzzed with a message from the school principal. We reviewed the incident. Our preliminary conclusion is that it was an unfortunate accident during playtime. No disciplinary action will be taken against Trevor. It was signed not just by the principal, but also by the district superintendent. Marcus read it twice. The blood in his ears roared, but his hands stayed still. He knew what this was. The system closing ranks. Protecting one of its own. By noon, a story was already circulating in the local Facebook Brookside Moms group, painting Amara as aggressive and verbally provoking Trevor before the bat made contact. They even called it self-defense. The kicker? A police report had already been filed, but it omitted the bat entirely, listing Amara's injury as a fall during play. No mention of blunt force trauma, no charges, no investigation. Here sits the bitter truth. Marcus understood all too well. Systems don't just fail, they practice failing for certain people. Over time it becomes muscle memory. When Marcus arrived at the hospital that evening, Amara was awake but quiet, the kind of quiet you don't want from a child. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Finally she whispered, "Daddy, they said I made him mad. Was it my fault?" It was like someone pressed a knife into his chest, and twisted. He leaned in, kept his voice steady. "Sunbeam, it was never your fault, ever, do you hear me?" But the truth was, Karen's version of events was already spreading, faster than the facts. The public breakdown came 2 days later during a school board meeting. Marcus had gone in prepared to speak calmly, strategically, and on record, but as he walked up to the podium, Karen stood from her seat in the front row. "You have no right to threaten my child," she said loudly, cutting across the room. "You stir turning a little playground accident into a witch hunt, because you can handle the idea that your daughter isn't perfect." The room shifted. The board members glanced at each other. Some audience members murmured in agreement. Marcus clenched the edges of the podium. His plan was to maintain composure, but in that moment he felt the heat rising up his neck. This was her tactic, to bait him into losing control in public, so she could frame him as the angry black father. And it almost worked. Almost. He forced himself to pause, to breathe, to step back from the mic without a word. But as he walked out of that meeting, the whispers following him, the headline already writing itself in the local paper, it felt like the battle had shifted against him. For the first time since this began, he questioned whether he could win. Marcus sat in his truck outside the school board meeting, engine off, hands gripping the wheel. He could still hear Karen's voice in his head, dripping with that perfect blend of mockery and moral superiority. He could also hear the whispers, the kind that don't fade easily, angry, intimidating, dangerous. That saps when his phone buzzed. It was a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Cole." The voice was low, steady. "You don't know me, but I was at the meeting tonight. You need to see something before they make it disappear." 10 minutes later, Marcus was sitting in a small diner booth, across from a woman in her 40s. She slid a flash drive across the table. "It sets the school security footage," she said. "The day Trevor hit your daughter, you still see the whole thing, no edits. I pulled it before they could exist it." When Marcus got home and played the video, his stomach turned. The footage showed Trevor approaching Amara on the playground, speaking to her for several seconds before suddenly swinging the bat. there was no play, no struggle for the bat, just an unprovoked strike, followed by Karen arriving within 2 minutes, ushering Trevor away before a teacher could intervene. And then came the spark. Marcus realized the footage wasn't just proof, it was leverage, but not in the obvious sense of sending it straight to the police, where it would disappear in the same system protecting Trevor. This needed a layered release, one that forced multiple institutions to respond publicly before they could coordinate a cover-up. That night, he opened a legal pad and started drawing circles, each representing a different point of pressure. Local journalists with big online followings. Civil rights groups that specialized in education reform. A handful of politicians in election season who couldn't afford the optics of ignoring a violent act against a black child. And one national media contact who owed him a favor. The plan was simple in theory, dangerous in execution. Release the footage in waves, each time with just enough reach to force the next level of attention, until the story became too public for anyone to bury. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Sometimes the turning point isn't about finding new strength, it's about rediscovering the discipline to use what you already have, without firing all your shots at once. By 2 a.m., Marcus had made his first move, sending a clipped 10-second teaser of the footage to the journalist Karen had once humiliated at a fundraiser. No audio, no names, just a shadowed boy with a bat and a small girl falling to the ground. The caption read, Brookside Elementary, unedited footage, full release soon. The war had quietly begun. The morning after the teaser dropped, Marcus didn't check the comments. He didn't need to. By the time he poured his coffee, his phone had lit up with texts from people asking, "Is that?" followed by "You have to release the rest." But Marcus wasn't rushing. He'd been in enough fights, in uniform and out, to know that patience wins more battles than speed. Day 1, the clip traveled quietly through local group chats, PTA threads, and neighborhood forums. No context, just whispers. Day 3, Marcus sent the full unedited footage, not to the police, not to the school, but to 3 trusted contacts. A local parent who'd been fighting bias in school suspensions. A youth advocacy lawyer with a talent for rallying public opinion. The journalist who'd received the teaser, now eager for the full story. He attached a single condition: release it only after I give the signal. Day 5, he started seeding supporting evidence. Screenshots from the Brookside Moms group where Karen and her allies mocked other children. The school's discipline record showing a pattern of disproportionately harsh punishments for black students, with Trevor's name conspicuously absent from any consequence lists. But here's the part Karen never saw coming. Marcus was operating like an invisible hand. While public attention built, his own name stayed out of it. He wasn't the angry father in the story, he was just a ghost in the wires, feeding oxygen to a fire nobody could trace back to him. Meanwhile in person, he played his role perfectly, calm, cordial, even attending the next PTA meeting as though nothing was happening. People underestimated men who smiled while quietly tightening the net. Then came the first crack. The school district's communications office sent an email to parents, insisting the incident circulating online was taken out of context. Within hours, the journalist released the full 45-second footage. The backlash was immediate and loud. Hashtags began trending locally. #Justice for Amara and #Brookside cover-up. Civil rights groups reached out. A city council member demanded an emergency review of the school's handling of the case. Here's what that moment teaches us. Power often hides in the shadows, but when you choose to pull it into the light, do it in a way that forces it to stay there, no matter how badly it wants to crawl back. By the end of the week, the question wasn't whether Trevor had hit Amara, the question was why the system had gone to such lengths to protect him. And Marcus was just getting started. The school board meeting was supposed to be routine, budget allocations, minor policy updates, the kind of bureaucratic monotony Karen excelled at controlling. But this night was different. The meeting room was packed wall to wall. Reporters lined the back, their cameras already rolling. Members of local and national civil rights groups filled the seats. Parents, many of whom had never spoken up before, clutched printed copies of school records, screenshots, and transcripts. Marcus sat near the back, his presence almost invisible, a quiet observer. When the meeting opened for public comment, the first person to speak wasn't Marcus. It was a mother whose son had been suspended for aggressive behavior after bumping into another student in the hallway, a suspension that had cost him his spot on the basketball team. She read the details of his case, and then held up the footage of Trevor hitting Amara with the bat. "Explain to me," she said, voice steady but shaking with rage, "how my son deserved 3 days suspension for an accident, but this wasn't even documented." Gasps rippled through the room. Next, the civil rights attorney Marcus had contacted stepped to the podium. She laid out a timeline, showing how Karen had intervened at each step, calling the principal, texting school board members, even sending a private message to the police chief, all within 2 hours of the incident. Screenshots of those messages lit up the projection screen for everyone to see. Karen tried to speak up, but the board president, clearly aware of the cameras, told her to wait her turn. And then came the breaking blow. The journalist released a pre-scheduled article mid-meeting, complete with embedded video, interviews from other parents, and a headline that read, "Brookside sits, 2 systems of justice, 1 playground, 2 realities." It spread across social media, instantly. National outlets began calling in. The board members' phones buzzed right there at the table. Karen's face flushed red, then pale. Her son's name, Trevor Matthews, was now being spoken aloud on live streams. Here sits what that moment teaches us. True reversals don't happen when you simply prove someone wrong. They happen when the truth becomes so undeniable that even their allies can't defend them without sharing in their shame. By the time the meeting adjourned, the superintendent had announced an independent investigation. Trevor was suspended indefinitely, and Karen walked out without making eye contact with a single person. Marcus didn't speak a word the entire night. He didn't need to. The work was done. But he knew the story was instead over. The morning after the board meeting, Brookside felt different. Local news vans lined the street outside the district office. Parents were giving on-camera interviews about years of bias they'd been too afraid to speak on before. Teachers, anonymously at first, confirmed the 2 systems everyone had suspected, but no one had been able to prove. By noon, the superintendent announced her resignation for personal reasons. 2 board members quietly stepped down within the week. Karen's world, once carefully manicured, was collapsing. Trevor's suspension became an expulsion after the independent review confirmed not just the bad incident, but a string of prior, unpunished assaults. His athletic scholarship prospects vanished overnight. Colleges stopped calling. And here sits the part that surprised everyone. Marcus didn't sit gloat. He didn't show up at the school to claim victory. Instead, he redirected the spotlight. Using the momentum, he worked with the civil rights attorney and local parents to launch a new policy: mandatory third-party review for any incident involving violence at school, and automatic release of security footage to parents of involved students. The initiative passed unanimously in the following month. As for Amara, her recovery was slow but steady. She started smiling again, a little at first, then more with each week. When she returned to school, it wasn't to whispers about what happened, but to a line of classmates waiting to walk in with her. One afternoon, she asked her father, "Daddy, did we win?" Marcus thought for a long moment before answering. "We didn't just win, Sunbeam. We changed the rules so the next kid doesn't have to fight this fight." Here sits what that moment teaches us. Redemption isn't always about the person who caused harm. Sometimes it's about restoring balance to a place that forgot what fairness looks like. Karen, for her part, disappeared from public life. Her once dominant voice in Brookside circles was replaced by a silence so complete, it was almost as if she'd never been there. But Marcus knew better. Silence doesn't erase history, it just marks the place where someone finally learned they could be held accountable. Months later, Brookside wasn't the same place. Parents talked openly about bias at PTA meetings without fear of being shut down. The school district's 2 systems had been forced into the open, and the new third-party review policy meant no single parent, no matter how influential, could rewrite the facts. Amara thrived again. Her teachers described her as more confident, more willing to speak up when something felt wrong. Marcus noticed it too. It wasn't the same innocence she'd had before. Some parts of childhood, once broken, don't fully return, but it was replaced with a quiet strength. Marcus had learned something as well. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it works best in whispers, in patience, in strategy, in the deliberate choice to fight a battle in a way that changes more than just the scoreboard. Here sits what that moment teaches us. When injustice comes to your door, the instinct is to swing back fast and hard. But if you can channel that fire into a plan, one that reshapes the very ground your enemy stands on, you don't just win, you change what's possible for everyone who comes after you. Karen and Trevor's names had become cautionary tales in Brookside, not because Marcus destroyed them, but because the truth did, and truth, once fully exposed, has a way of living on far longer than outrage. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. Stand for your people, even when the system wants it. Be patient enough to let your enemies build their own trap, and prepared enough to close it when the time comes. Remember that the fight isn't just about the person in front of you, it's about the countless others they think they can hurt without consequence. Marcus never set out to be a hero. He set out to protect his daughter, but in doing so he shifted an entire community's sense of what accountability looks like. And now, It's your turn to think about the battles in front of you. Not every fight needs to be loud. Some need to be precise, strategic, relentless. If this story resonated with your values, like, comment, and subscribe, because we need more people who know how to fight with both heart and strategy.